And now I'd like to introduce you to our feature presenter today, Professor Bill Burnett. So Bill is an adjunct professor of mechanical engineering and the executive director of the design program here at Stanford. He directs the undergraduate and graduate programs in design and teaches at the D School. He received his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science in Product Design at Stanford, and he has worked in startups and Fortune 100 companies, including 7 years at Apple designing award-winning laptops and a number of years in the toy industry designing Star Wars action figures. He holds a number of mechanical and design patents and design awards, and in addition to his duties at Stanford, he is on the board of Voss, a socially responsible fashion startup, and advises several other startup companies. And now I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Mona, and good morning, everyone. We're going to have a conversation this morning about creativity, both as an individual and creativity inside your organizations. And I always like to start with a quote from Edward de Bono. Edward de Bono was a big creativity consultant and expert, sort of in the 60s and 70s. He's not as well known today as he was then. But his tagline that I will start with is, "You can't dig a new hole by digging an old one deeper." And so oftentimes when we find ourselves stuck and we're looking for an innovative or a creative solution, we've got to go looking in new places. So a little bit of background, I'm going to base this all on the principles that we teach here at Stanford called design thinking. Design thinking is a methodology that used to be called human-centered design, which employs a lot of different tools to make teams and individuals more creative. Design thinking is all about unlocking the potential and creating creative confidence in our students. That's David Kelley. He's our senior professor, also the founder of the D School, and the founder of the pretty well-known worldwide innovation consulting firm called IDEO. Design thinking has this, sort of a set of processes and a set of mindsets. This is our process diagram. We say don't start with the problem, start with people, start with empathy, and then redefine and ideate until you come up with a really, really interesting problem to solve. And then we build and we test and we build and we test. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the define and ideate bubbles in this webinar. And really I'm going to be taking you through what we call the mindsets of a designer. Most of us are trained in our daily jobs and just our lives to be kind of rational, skeptical people. That's a good thing to be in business, to try to break problems down into simpler subsets and then use those, our analysis to try to figure our way out of a problem or to solve our way forward in a set of difficulties. But mostly in design, that's not useful because we're trying to create things that we've never created before. We're trying to create new things, right? So we start with curiosity. Curiosity is the mindset that we think has the best energy for innovation. Then we typically reframe the problem. Peter Drucker, the famous business guru from Harvard, is famous for saying, "There's nothing quite so useless as to solve a problem really, really well that never needed to be solved in the first place." So most of the time we find that folks are working kind of on the wrong problem. Often they're looking at something that's too small. They're looking at a symptom of a problem. So reframing is important. Radical collaboration, because the answer's out in the world with the people that you're designing for. Mindful of process, because sometimes you want to flare in the design process and come up with lots of ideas, and sometimes you want to be focusing in on testing just a few things. And a bias to action. And a bias to action and curiosity will come up again and again in this talk as we focus in on the subject of human creativity. So design thinking, is this new approach or a sort of a codified approach to problem solving? It works really well on poorly bounded problems and problems where even if you solve it, then people's needs change and then they need a new solution and a new solution. It's a really good approach to problem finding. In fact, I think mostly what we do in design is come up with a better problem to solve. And it's a perspective on value creation. So that's the design thinking background for everything that I'm going to be talking about. This creativity thing, this issue of human creativity, creativity, the state or quality of being creative. What a terrible definition. I think I pulled this out of Webster's or something. To define a word with the word doesn't make much sense. But it is one of those things that I think we know it when we see it. We have friends, probably all of us have friends who we look at and go, wow, they're really creative. Perhaps they're artists or dancers or musicians. And their job, their role in society is to create new things, new music, new dance, new words on a page. They're writers. So what makes these people different from us? Why do we think these people are creative and sometimes we think we're not? Well, first of all, I want to point out that creativity isn't just a cognitive process. It is really part of this mind-body problem, this Western Cartesian division of, the mind and thinking is separate from the body, and somehow those two things don't have the same value. What we find when we look at the research on highly creative individuals is that they use both their intellectual intelligences. People would call that IQ or rational and analytic intelligence, but they are also highly emotionally intelligent. They have access to a wide variety of emotional states, and they use those emotional states to read the situation that they're in. So they have high emotional intelligence. They also typically have high kinesthetic intelligence, i.e. they're very good at understanding their body in time and space. And the merger of these multiple intelligences is one of the principal ways in which we identify people who we consider to be highly creative. So typically, when we're in a business situation and somebody says, hey, let's have a brainstorm. We need to come up with some new ideas for the marketing strategy or the product strategy. Well, we've been probably coming from some kind of an analytic point of view before we arrive at that meeting. We've been at the budget meeting or the planning meeting or doing some analysis on something. And now we're being asked to do synthesis. We're being asked to take lots and lots of inputs and combine them in brand new ways and come up with new ideas. In order to move from the analytic to the synthetic side of your brain, literally from pretty much the left to the right side, I'll keep using the left-right brain model. It's not accurate that all the creativity is in the right side of the brain, all the analysis is in the left. But it's a reasonable model that we can use, to sort of describe the different types of thinking. We have a saying in the engineering school: all models are wrong, but some models are useful, and the left-right brain model is somewhat useful in this description. So how do we move from the analytical to the synthetic side of our brain? How do we move from the analysis to the creative brain? Well, a bad way to do it is just sit in a room and just start trying to have ideas. I always say if you don't warm up, you pull a muscle. If you don't warm up, in this case, you will pull a conceptual muscle. What we do, and this is a fantastic resource for anybody who's trying to coach their team into higher creativity, is we use a lot of tools from the improv comedy world and from the improv dramatic world. And Patricia Ryan Madsen, who wrote this book, Improv Wisdom, was a professor here at Stanford, a very beloved professor of the improv classes, some of the hardest classes to get into and some of the most delightful. And Patricia wrote this book, Improv Wisdom, Don't Prepare, Just Show Up. It's a great resource, including many, many, many improv activities and exercises that she puts together, and also sort of the philosophy of how improvisation works. So whenever we host or create a brainstorming session or a creativity session of some sort, whatever tools we're going to use, before we start the team off on that, and after we've defined a pretty good idea of what it is we're trying to work on, we do an improv. Sound ball is a simple game where you just stand in a circle and you make an imaginary ball with your hands and you throw it to someone else in the circle, making a sound. They catch it with the same sound, and then they change the shape of the ball and they throw it to another person. The Proverbs game, you stand in a circle and everybody says one word. Eventually you create a sentence and pretty soon you create a proverb. When the team decides the proverb is completed, they put their hands together and they go, yes, 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 yes. Remember a Time When is a game where we just invent a story on the fly. And Point and Shout, probably the simplest game that you can play. You literally walk around the room pointing at things and shouting out a name, but it can't be the name of the thing you're pointing to. So if I'm pointing to a laptop, I might say tree. If I'm pointing to Chris, I might say rabbit. If I'm pointing to this clicker, I would say ice cream. So you have to label something differently than the name that it is normally given. The reason we do these games, by the way, and particularly Point and Shout and Soundball, they loosen up the brain. They loosen up the connections that are rigidly attached to naming things or the way in which the world works. And by doing these games, you kind of get your brain out of the spreadsheet mode and into the creative mode. So take a look at Patricia's book, and I'm going to try to give you a resource for every one of these things that you can go, easily look up and buy on, at your favorite bookstore. So there are many, many more games. Look at Patricia's book, and there's a number of websites now that aggregate improv games. The other thing is, you can't be creative in the wrong space. We have an expression at the D School that space creates behavior. And let me show you a slide, and I want you to all imagine you're walking into this room, and then I want you to imagine what is your mental state as soon as you enter the room. And here's a classic room. Most of the rooms at Stanford and at all universities and at all high schools look like this room. A whole bunch of chairs bolted to the floor, all facing in the same direction. There's a little stage and either a whiteboard or a screen. And when you walk into this room, you know exactly what behavior is required of you. You will come in, you will sit down. Some of you like to sit in the front, most of you like to sit in the back. You'll open up your laptop or whatever you're going to take notes on. If you're a modern student, you'll open a Facebook chat and maybe a news feed. Because what happens is when you walk into this room, you know that the behavior is, and we call this kind of teaching sage on stage. Someone's going to get to the front of the room. They're going to either open up a presentation or go to the whiteboard or the chalkboard, and they're going to start talking. And your behavior is to sit down, shut up, and absorb information. By the way, all the research on this kind of teaching, this lecture mode teaching, says that the retention from lecture mode teaching is less than 20%. So we never teach this way when we teach design. We teach in a multi-purpose room with lots of motion and movement. But if you're trying to, I'm not forgetting teaching for a second, if you're trying to create an environment where the behaviors of creativity are required, you can't be in a space like this. One of the first things you can do, and when people come to the master class, we'll talk about that a little bit later, the Innovation Master Series master class. One of the first things we tell them to do is when you go back to your company or you go back to your school, blow out a conference room, get rid of all the tables and fixed chairs and all the sort of formal things that establish hierarchies, and make a space that looks more like this. This is the one of the bays in the D School building. You'll notice all the tables are on wheels, all the chairs are mobile and lightweight. Most of the whiteboards either roll around or they drop down from the ceilings on rails. And that allows us to do a bunch of different things in the space that create a stand-up, bias to action, physical, remember kinesthetic intelligence is important, physical activity that demands that the students are in a creative mode and not in a leaning back, passive, receiving information mode. So space is critical. And there's some really interesting research on this. This came in on a New Yorker article about a couple of years back, that the idea of raw space is the best. So Harvard did a study of 36,000 scientific papers that were ranked on a scale of innovation, which were the most highly contributed, most innovative, most interesting, research that was groundbreaking. And they looked at where physically, where were the people who wrote those papers, the innovators, where were they? Two things that were interesting. There's a famous Building 20 at MIT that was just kind of thrown up as a temporary building during World War II when they needed extra space for researchers who were working on, I don't know, war stuff or something. Anyway, the building just stayed, and it was kind of this crummy old building, and nobody liked it. But new teams who didn't have any space got thrown there. Turns out, when you co-locate, this is the radical collaboration part, when you co-locate different disciplines in the same space, and when the space is raw, easily modified, not precious, like if you wanted to, you could just cut a hole in the wall because you needed extra room for your experiment to shoot a laser down the thing, and that's what people did in Building 20. They would literally just get a saw and cut a hole in the wall so they could run their experiment, or they would drill something and attach it to the floor or to a post. Because the space was easily modified, it was a creative gym for the researchers, And of the most significant papers that came out of this 36,000 paper study, the ones where the innovators were co-located, i.e. radical collaboration was happening, and they were in easily modified environments, they got the highest ranking for innovation. So that's fairly powerful data that says space is really going to change, the way people work. You just can't go to that conference room that you always go to for the contentious, product resourcing meetings, because that conference room has just got bad juju. So don't go there. Creative space suggestions. Do create a special place where you're not allowed to do other activities. An idea room, some people call it a war room. Some people just call it, the creativity room, creativity gym, whatever you want to call it. But make sure that it has an identity around creativity, not around the other kinds of tasks. It's really critical. You'll notice in the picture I showed you of the D School up in the corner there that there's Post-it notes everywhere. That's a very visual environment. You need to make the information you generate, the ideas you generate, the personas that you're investigating as you're doing your design. You need to make those ideas visible and persistent. The team needs to be able to come back to that room a day later, a week later, whatever. They've gone out in the field, they've got more data, they've come back to the room. They need to be able to see the old data, because that's how they're going to make these nonlinear connections between something you did 2 weeks ago and something you're doing, next week. So make the ideas visible and make them persistent. Remove all status clues. Status creates hierarchy. Hierarchy defeats creativity. So you'll notice if you ever walk into a D-School classroom, unlike that Sage on Stage classroom where it's really clear where the important person stands and it's really clear where everybody else sits, in the D-School classrooms, there's no visible hierarchy. There is no front or back of the room. There are places where there's some screens, but they are no more special than any other place in the room. It defeats the Sage on Stage effect, and it makes the rooms what we call self-authoring. When everything's on wheels and everything can be hacked and nothing is precious, then the team has the ability to create the space they need for the information that they're gathering and for the activities that they're performing. I'm going to make the argument over and over again here that creativity is actually just a series of behaviors. And I can't tell the difference between a creative person and a non-creative person if they're doing the same behaviors. In fact, just act like a creative person and you will be one. But the space is critical, right? So it's a mind-body problem. You got to warm up. You got to be in a great space, otherwise you'll defeat yourself. By the way, Make Space is a book put together by two of the guys who designed the D-School, Scott Dorley and Scott Withoff. It's a great book, another reference for you if you're looking for how to change either a space at your corporation or your company, or just a space in your home where you go to do your best writing or your best drawing or your best creativity. So in this ideation bubble, there's a pretty interesting set of exercises that we do. And I'm going to try to run one with you right now. If you can, get a piece of paper. And I just want you to put 30 circles on that piece of paper. What I've got here is sort of 6 columns by 5 rows. So if you could just quickly draw on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, 6, then 6, then 6, then 6, then 6, 30 circles. Give you a second to do that. We're going to try to run this. It can't be interactive because I can't see you doing it and we can't talk back and forth. But if you just follow the instructions carefully, I think you'll have an interesting experience. Okay, let's assume you've got 30 circles or so done. You can just keep writing more circles as you go. You're going to draw that grid of circles 5 by 6. And here's your instructions. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to complete this task. Turn the circles into something. I'll give you 3 minutes. And here's an example. You could turn the circles into a smiley face. All right, are you ready? I'm going to play a little music here to kind of assist you in your brainstorming and creativity activities. And you ready? Go. Just turning circles into something. Smiley faces, soccer balls, you know what to do. you're doing. By the way, this is a creativity exercise. I want to see examples and ideas I've never seen before. And you're running out of time. You've got less than 2 minutes. So be creative. Don't screw up. Do this well. Keep going, don't stop, don't get stuck. Okay, now you're really running out of time. There's less than a minute left. I need you to be as creative as possible. And make sure, by the way, that you come up with original ideas. If you get more than 30, just keep going. I have students do 60, 70, 90 circles in 3 minutes. Okay, you're really running out of time now. Let's see if we can get all those circles finished. Okay, stop. How'd you do? And I saw some things come up on the chat about, like, can we please turn off that obnoxious music? I'm gonna debrief this with you in a second, but let me explain a couple things. First of all, I set up probably the worst possible scenario for creativity. I put you under ridiculous time pressure. I gave you ambiguous information. I gave you an unclear goal, and then I just kept yelling at you that you were running out of time. Does this sound or feel anything like a project you've been on at work? Where somebody says, we need a great answer, and then your boss is checking on you every 10 minutes going, you got one yet? You got one yet? You got one yet? This is not the way you manage or promote or certainly manage creativity. But it's a little simulation that I like to do because it's it brings up a whole bunch of the issues around this idea of fear and getting stuck and how do you manage a process that's really, really kind of an ambiguous thing. So first of all, did you get stuck? I bet a lot of people did. Stuck means I did soccer ball, baseball, blah, blah, and then I ran out of balls and I'm stuck and then I don't know what to do. But hopefully you got unstuck. And you had what we call an aha moment where you went, oh, so what if I made it into a flower? Hey, that's a different thing. Soccer balls are inside the circle, flowers are outside the circle. Maybe you had a couple of those moments of stuck and unstuck. And that was probably because the way your brain is organized, it likes to solve problems in what psychologists call schemas. It creates a schema for a solution, and then it just stays inside that schema and tries until it runs out of ideas. So this notion of schemas, here's a really simple example. This guy who's running across the finish line is a guy named Roger Bannister. He's a 25-year-old medical student at the time when he actually was the first man to run less than a 4-minute mile on May 6, 1954. Up until that point, people considered the 4-minute mile pretty much an impossible barrier. No one could run it. There were even psychologists and physiologists saying no one could run that fast. The human body couldn't manage it. Roger was an English student in med school at the time, only practiced 2 or 3 days a week, unlike modern athletes, and just had regular shoes and stuff. But he was a dedicated runner, and he broke the record. Now, up until that point, because the schema was this was impossible, no one else was even close. However, Roger was one of those natural creatives who didn't understand that there were rules, and he just broke the record. After that, 16 runners had done the same thing by the end of 1957. Well over 1,000 runners have achieved more than 4 minutes or better. In fact, if you want to get on the Stanford track team, you better be darn close to that number, coming out of high school. So it's just an example of when, you set up an idea of how something is, and you just get stuck in that idea until somebody else breaks the record. Now, as soon as Roger broke the record, it was no longer a schema, that it was impossible. And obviously, lots and lots of people have done it. I know of lots of schemas for solving 30 circles. Let me show you a few. I set you up, I gave you the inside the circle schema with the smiley face. How many people got outside the circles, flowers and other things that can be built outside the circle? There, by the way, it was an ambiguous objective. I just said solve the problem, turn the circles into something. You probably made up a bunch of rules. How many people did 2 circles and realized there was no rule against doing something like 2 circles, making eyeglasses or the wheels of a bus? If you can do 2, you can do 3, you can do a millipede, a centipede, you could even do a 30-circle-pede, but it kind of, that's not as much fun, but it's available. It's one of the schemas that you could do. You could assume that the circle was just the extrusion of a solid object, or it could be a hole in something, like you're looking through the paper. On the other side, imagine it's a porthole in a submarine and fish are swimming by. Circles could be a texture, right? And remember, I said do something with the circles. Now, if you fell into the schema that the circle is that little piece of ink printed on the page by a Xerox machine, then you didn't get this schema, which is simply manipulating the thing the circles are on. Now, if you didn't think of any of those, that means that schema wasn't actually available to you. It never came into your consciousness. Why? Probably because you made up a rule that said that's not allowable. And you were unconscious that you made up the rule, and you were unconscious that you had these possible ideas, but they never came to the forefront of your thinking because you had defined a box around this problem that didn't exist. One of my favorite solutions to this problem, by the way, is I was doing this with an executive team, and at some point, one of the guys just got up and sat in a sort of a meditation position on the table, and I went around the room debriefing, and I said, I can't help but notice, sir, that you're sitting on the table meditating. And he was sitting on the paper of 30 circles. And I said, what's up? And he said, well, it occurred to me that the circle is the symbol for infinity. And so that if I simply meditated on the idea of the circle, that I would do all of the circles. That's an A+ answer in a creativity forum. So I'm going to make the argument that if you want to be more creative, you got to train yourself to get stuck, because designers get stuck all the time. We're going to do stuff we've never done before. When I was at Apple, we were doing the first laptops. We had no idea how laptops would work. We were the first people to put the keyboard in the back and the pointing device in the front. That came out of hundreds of prototypes. Again, John Krakauer invented it totally out of the blue. But we got stuck and got stuck and got stuck and got stuck all the time. Train yourself to get stuck, because you can't, the aha feeling comes right after the schemas have collapsed and I've got no ideas. And then you examine, what's available to me that I'm not thinking of, right? So 30 circles shows you how you get stuck, shows you what that feels like. It explores sometimes how to get unstuck and how that happens. By the way, when you're stuck, your brain goes into fight or flight mode. That's the fear response. When you get unstuck, there's a flood of dopamine and happy chemicals in your brain because you've solved a problem and you feel great. Designers get hooked on that unstuck feeling. This is a very simple exercise you can run with your groups. It triggers this conceptual block. It demonstrates how our brain utilizes rules for problem solving. And the more you do this and the more you discover new solutions to this very simple problem, the more you will lower your fear that getting stuck is a problem. So back in the ideate bubble, the one thing that most people do is brainstorming. And most people, when we observe them, do it quite poorly. Here's a new model. I want you to think of yourself not as a brainstormer when you go to a brainstorming meeting. I want you to think of yourself as a fantastic jazz musician. And here's why. Jazz ensemble is very much like a brainstorming group. When people get together in a jazz ensemble, and I'll use the Miles Davis Sextet on Kind of Blue, the most popular jazz album ever still, released back I think in '58. Fantastic players, Bill Evans, Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers, Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and they sat down to play a bunch of songs that they'd played hundreds of times before, but the goal was to play them in a way they'd never played, to make music that they had never heard before. In order to do that, they had to be excellent at their instruments. They had to be fantastic so that the mechanics fell away, and that they could just respond in the moment. And a brainstorming group like a jazz group, everybody takes a solo. Everybody has an idea on a post-it and goes up to the board and headlines it. And while someone's headlining, the job of the group is to make that person feel special, smart, clever, creative. Just like in a jazz ensemble, when Miles is soloing, the goal of the group is to support that solo and make it sound great. And when he's done, he'll pass it to somebody else, and they don't know what they're going to play until the moment it occurs to play off of what he's done. Now, there's a structure. There's the song they're playing, or in the brainstorming example, there's the problem we're brainstorming about. So we're always coming back to that structure, but we're coming back to it in an amazingly creative way. To get this good at brainstorming, you've got to practice. And the mechanics of brainstorming well are difficult. Having ideas in the moment is difficult. And perfect mechanics do not make perfect improvisation. There's lots of people who are great at their instrument and they can't improvise at all. It's partly a 10,000 hour problem. I'd say that most people who do this do it so infrequently that they never actually gain any even novice skills at this, much less mastery. I think it takes you about 100 hours of really good brainstorming to get to a novice, maybe 1,000 to move from novice to expert, and 10,000 from expert to mastery, where you can literally put yourself in this kind of thinking, a very different kind of thinking, playing in the moment off of the ideas of others, and coming out of the brainstorming session with ideas you never had before, that were not in your mind or in your consciousness in any form. And to be able to be free to create in the moment and improvise with your mind, your body, and your emotional intelligence, it's a result of years of practice. By the way, there are 4 steps to brainstorming. Most people just come in, they come up with an idea, they brainstorm, and then somebody says, I'll take a picture of the post-its on the wall, and nothing ever happens. There's no actionability in those kinds of brainstorms. I always say that cell phones are where ideas go to die. Nobody ever does anything with the picture of the post-its. So you got to come up with a good problem. You got to warm up well. We've talked about that. Use the brainstorming rules to make sure you get lots of ideas, and then making it bias to action, making the brainstorms actionable. You have to select with the right criteria. Let me just reinforce 2 things. In the brainstorming rules, of course, you're deferring judgment. Why? Because you don't want people to be afraid of being stupid. They have to be able to say stupid things. You have to be able to lower the fear threshold. And you will model this. If you're running the brainstorming session, model it by saying really stupid, crazy things to make it okay for that to be a behavior in the brainstorm. So you defer judgment, you go over lots of ideas, and you encourage wild ideas. Not because the wild ideas are the good ones, but because it's the wild ideas that we build off of. It's that crazy solo that gives me a chance to come up with something I've never thought of before. So you have to have the wild ideas. And you can steal, we say build off the ideas of others. Just steal Mona's idea, steal Chris's idea, and use it as a basis for your own idea. That's how you get great output. But then, rather than just, taking the picture and going home, and if I'm your boss and I say, hey, how did the brainstorm go? Yeah, we had a lot of ideas. Well, what happened? Yeah, we had a lot of ideas, and Mona took a picture of the board, and we're gonna pass that around. Like, so what? Nothing happened. When I run a brainstorming session, people will say, if someone says, what happened? They'll say, we had 125 ideas. We broke them into 5 categories. 3 of those we think are strategically on point with what we're doing in our group today. And of those 3, we've distilled out from the crazy ideas 4 prototypes that we think we want to run next week. That's an actionable biased action brainstorm. So the right way to think about this is when you're taking this massive ideas, wild, bad, crazy ideas, and you're selecting them, don't select them for feasibility, select them for potential. And we use words like, give me the most delightful ideas. Give me the most amazing ideas. And give me the ideas that would work if we didn't care about the laws of physics or the economics of the situation. Because we want to build off of the ideas that have the highest potential for impact not simply the ones that we know how to do. Look, the ones we know how to do, we had those ideas before we came into the brainstorming session. What's the point? Pick the stuff that has high potential. Brainstorming, if you do it well, will transform both you and your group. The data shows that novices with poor setup and follow through brainstorm poorly. They get poor outputs, poor results. Good brainstorming, though, is like great jazz. You have to be good enough. I mean, if I handed you a saxophone and said, sit in with Miles Davis, and you never played saxophone before, what's the chance that you're going to make a contribution to that improv? 0. So you have to be expert enough. You got to get to your 100 hours of good practice. And if you want to improve your overall output for brainstorming, for you, for your team, for your organization, make sure you warm up first with improv games and select ideas for potential, not feasibility. You do those two things and you will avoid the pitfalls of 90% of the people. When I go in, I do an innovation audit on that company and I watch people brainstorm, 90% of the time they're doing none of those things. But let's get to the core of this creativity thing. I keep bringing up the fear issue. I'm going to give you a poll. And so real quickly, we're going to pop over to a poll. And the question is, were you more creative as a child? Pick any age, 8, 10 years old, when you remember yourself being a kid, playing with blocks and Legos and running around, and you could make a stick into any toy you wanted. Tell me, were you more creative as a child than you are today? We'll put up the poll. Give you a couple minutes to answer that question. Does that look like we got a good response? Okay. Response is, well, 53% of you say, I think it was more creative. 23% say, no. And the other 24% in the middle of sort of maybe. So half of you think you're more creative. Another quarter of you say, I don't know, maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. A lot will depend on what your personal definition of creativity is. But I'm going for the definition of, I was free to make crazy ideas happen. I could turn any object into a toy. My imagination had no boundaries because there was very few social constructs around what was allowable. But as we got older, and school happened, and grown-ups told us not to act inappropriately, we built up appropriate layers of social conditioning, i.e. fear, around doing things that were considered out of bounds. And that conditioning has a huge impact on the ideas that are actually available to our consciousness, because our consciousness likes to have acceptable ideas, and it likes to schematize ideas, as we showed in 30 circles. So it's a kind of dangerous situation. Let's do a little deeper dive on this. Your brain is essentially a big set of electrical circuits, electrical and chemical circuits. It operates on about 40 watts of energy. Now, the laptops that are running this workshop are about 160, 70 watt laptops, and I looked it up. The Watson computer that IBM built that won the Jeopardy challenge was 260,000 watts of energy. So the brain, which is pretty amazing, it can write poetry, it can be Shakespeare, it can design rockets to fly to the moon. It's a pretty underpowered little processor. That's one of the reasons why it has to chunk information down to some simple things, and it has to control the amount of information that is available to you. Otherwise, you'd go kind of crazy. But there's a notion of neural Darwinism that says that the brain has evolved through resource competition and adaptation to process information at the lowest possible energy state, because it's competing for energy with all the rest of the body. Now, the brain weighs about 3 pounds, which in the average person is about 2 to 3% of your body weight. But it takes up 25% of the energy you eat every day. If you about 2,000 calorie is the average energy that most people consume every day, and the brain takes up almost 500 calories to operate. So it's a huge energy sucking organ. Probably couldn't take any more energy than that if the rest of the body were to function. So if that's true, and this is a scheme from Dan Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence, and Don Norman, who's a psychologist and a cognitive scientist. They've got this model for the brain that says Well, you've got all this stuff that comes in the stimulus. You've got all this stuff that goes out, unconscious responses, like I just drove to work and I don't even know how I did it, or I'm breathing and I'm walking and I'm not processing most of that information. And then conscious responses. And we think that whatever we see is what creates the conscious response. But in fact, there's a lot of evidence that that's not true at all, that what happens is stuff goes in, it gets sorted into these schemas. There's that little box there in the big green box called preconsciousness. That's the thing that's predicting what's going to happen next. And that's what gets loaded into consciousness. And so the psychologists say is we don't actually see what we're looking at. We just see what we're looking for. We just see what our preconscious processor has primed us to look for. So there's a famous video of people passing basketballs around, and a gorilla walks through the video, and nobody sees the gorilla. There's lots and lots of evidence that we're really only working inside a very small amount of information in order for our little 40-watt processor to construct this reality for us. And guess what? Consciousness, the actual moment of awareness, this filtering in the world, is only 300 milliseconds. And we know this because, unfortunately, people who've had brain tumors or other brain defects, we know that long-term memory is where we store all of our ideas and memories, and it gets processed through sleep. Short-term memory, which is 6 to 8 minutes long. If you ever watched the movie Memento, where the guy had no long-term memory and his whole reality was 8 minutes, that's where information from right now goes to be sort of sorted and organized. And then we go into this consciousness piece, because we've seen there was a famous patient who had no short-term memory and no long-term memory. He lived in a 300 millisecond now. That was all he had. He could not form memories, did not know who he was talking to, literally. So this 300 millisecond now is being sorted into frames that are organized around our short-term memory, put in sort of some kind of a context so we can have conversations. And then we have the broader context because things get stored in long-term memory. So what's actually happening, rather than this continuous experience we think we're having of reality, is we're constructing a movie, guys. It's a movie that's made up from a bunch of information that's been sorted through the schematic thinking processor and organized around what we think's going to happen, not what's actually happening. The famous minimalist artist Robert Irwin, who has a great piece over here in the Stanford Museum, had an expression that seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. Seeing, truly seeing what's in front of me, is forgetting all the labels and all the schemas and just being in that moment of seeing. We rarely achieve that kind of consciousness, and mostly we're just seeing what we think is there or what we want to be there. If you're going to be a creative person, you have to understand the way that reality is constructed in our brains, and then see where the set points are for you to interrupt that reality to create a different movie. Because actually, when you get good at this, you can create any movie you want. The other research on creativity is that people who are highly creative, and there's some tests for this, have these three characteristics. They actually do perceive the world differently. They have more visual perception, more tactile perception. That's the visual intelligence, the physical intelligences that they have. They're a little bit higher. They have a high social awareness response, which is the empathy response. Doesn't mean that they're extroverts. Many highly creative people are introverts. If you know some artist friends or writer friends, they're often introverts. But they have an awareness of social things that are around them. But the real critical thing is they have a low fear response to novelty. This is, they put them in a scanner and they show them stuff that they've never seen before, and the normal brain will react, and the fight or flight response will turn on, and you'll go, wow, I should run away from this scary thing, or I should at least back up. Creative people don't have that. Instead, they don't go, oh, wow, what's that, in a frightened way. They go, oh, wow, what's that? That's curiosity, guys. And that's totally trainable. If it turns out that this brain research holds to be true, and again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. If this model turns out to be true, this low fear response to novelty, if that's the characteristic of highly creative, naturally creative people, well, that's actually a brain defect. There's not something extra in their brain that you don't have. You got the same circuits, and I can teach you to turn them off. I can teach you to turn off the fear response to novelty when you want to, when it's appropriate to, in a brainstorming session or a mind mapping session, or using any of the other tools that we teach people in the master class or at the D-School. So you can learn this, and therefore creativity is learnable. We're all in a box. That's just the truth. The box is real. It's how our brain evolved. Creativity is probably a brain deficit, which is good news. Creativity is this high energy brain behavior that turns on lots and lots of circuits, and the brain is lazy. It doesn't want to do that. You have to learn how to do that. And if you can lower your fear of failure and learn to utilize the manipulation of schemas to interrupt this model of the world, this movie of the world, and build a different one, and access your improvisational and other intelligence, kinesthetic and emotional intelligence, you can absolutely turn yourself in to the most creative person that I've ever met. But it takes a lot of practice. I just want to throw in one quick case study, and we'll get to some questions. People will say, well, who's doing this? Who's doing this in the industry that's doing it well? I can't think of anybody better than IBM. IBM's been on about a 4-year, almost 5-year process of bringing design thinking into the company and changing the culture. From Ginny Rometty, the CEO, has been there about 7-8 years, and a guy named Phil Gilbert, who's running the design group. And they've created they've decided that, in a technical company like IBM, what you measure is what matters. And so they've created 6 badging systems, from design thinking coach to design thinking leader. And all business leaders who run a P&L in IBM, in addition to other metrics, are measured on how many people have been badged in design thinking, i.e. can brainstorm well, know what mind mapping is, know how to do an ethnographic interview, and discover new ideas for products and services. The 6 levels, they have over 90,000 people who have been badged at the design thinking practitioner level. 90,000 people in a company of 300-some thousand. That's the fastest, most powerful deployment of these creativity tools and techniques that I've seen anywhere, and IBM is absolutely knocking it out of the park. There's another piece of research I won't go into from Forrester that says IBM's transformation is resulting in a 300% ROI and cutting them time to market for their most innovative products by 50%. So this is a powerful tool in industry, but it's really all about the individual. You can't be in a creative group if you're not a creative person. You can't play in that quintet with Miles Davis unless you really, really know your instrument. So the takeaway, changing yourself, it's really just all about changing your behaviors. 3 powerful methods. Get stuck more often so you can experience how you get unstuck. What is your methodology? Move to the jazz brainstorming model, create a space that demands new behaviors, and model these behaviors, because if you act differently and you reward people in your organization differently, you will in fact see a shift in behaviors. And by the way, it turns out in the behavior change research, it takes at least 8 weeks before you see any results on any of this. So I'll leave you with the famous quote from Gandhi: be the change you want to see in the world. If you want to be more creative, you have to make the change that makes your behavior more creative. And if you model those behaviors for the people around you, your family, your kids, your friends, and the folks you work with, the change will happen.
And now, without further ado, we'd like to move on to the Q&A session. So, Bill, we have a lot of questions from our panelists that are really widely applicable, I would say, across the board. So, as you know, a lot of us work in kind of multi-generational, companies where you have some of the more experienced, professionals with 20, 30 years of experience working with fresh college grads. Mm-hmm. And in such an environment, how do you, I guess, first of all, use some of the tools that you talked about to loosen up some of the older traditional professionals who would possibly scoff at, some of the improv games that you mentioned earlier, and at the same time really encourage, the younger and more inexperienced professionals to really contribute ideas and kind of, help with this innovation process?
Well, I'd say 2 things. One is, most people want to be most people enjoy being more creative. It's not a hard thing to do. It takes a little bit of risk because sometimes you have to, do behaviors that you aren't comfortable with. We find that if you get a couple of senior managers trained on these kinds of ideas, and then they model why this is important for the group, you can kind of use the hierarchy a little bit to get people to loosen up and try things. But once they've tried them, they find that they have access to more interesting information, interesting ideas. They're more creative themselves, and most people enjoy the process of being more creative. So that's one thing. I think if you get some top-down buy-in from people and they're willing to model these behaviors, other people will try it. There's a great story that we once running a workshop for SAP, the big software company, and the D School was founded on the grant from one of the SAP founders, Hasso Plattner. He's the P in SAP. And Hasso was in the room with all of his executives, and and David Kelly was trying to lead an improv, and it wasn't going very well because of this very reason. It's unusual, and it's a bunch of German executives. So, but Hasso got up and he said, "Okay, guys, come on, let's really do this." And he started, actively working with David Kelly on this improv. I think they were doing Soundball, and because he was willing to do it, his executives were willing to do it. The other thing is, the 20-somethings and the young people in your organization, remember, these are the same kids that started Apple and Google and Facebook and Snapchat and all the companies that people look at and they say, wow, they're really innovative. You've got a gold mine with these young kids if you will treat them, not as, oh, you guys don't know anything, you just do menial work, you do, just do the spreadsheets for the boss kind of thing. If you engage them, they'll actually model these behaviors very easily and help lift the whole organization up. Because, when people come to the D School and they say, hey, I want to be more innovative, I go, who do you want to be like? And they cite all these companies. I go, guys, those companies were started by 25-year-olds. And they didn't have half the knowledge you had, but they weren't afraid to try something new.
Great. Well, thanks again, Bill. I think that's really helpful and, and really kind of emphasizes the importance of getting leadership involved and at the same time kind of, accepting some of the realities of these newer companies and newer inventions that are out there. So the second question that we have also kind of relates to, a modern and changing workforce is that, in fact, a lot of teams these days are remote.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of go about, building this creative space and really building that culture if, most of your team is kind of separated all across the country or across the world and you kind of only meet maybe once or twice together online?
Yeah, first of all, once or twice together online, maybe if you're doing that a week, you can probably build this culture. It's true. Most workforces now are distributed. When I do projects, I still do some design projects. My designers will be here, or like when I was at Apple, we were in Cupertino. Our manufacturing was in Asia. Some of our technology was in Japan or in Europe. Nothing, helps more than a face-to-face meeting. And I made it a point in all of my design teams that when we started a project, and these were, year-long projects to design a new laptop, that we all met at the beginning and we all met, at the manufacturing, at that point in the thing. But that's relatively expensive. Nowadays, people are meeting on Zoom or other online platforms. They're using Slack to create what we call, or any kind of a chat or text-based thing to create what we call asynchronous brainstorming. We don't all need to be in the same room. I can throw out an idea, then people can start building on that idea in a kind of a list format and, asynchronously. And then, the platforms, the video platforms now are good enough to get. I mean, we have 1,000 people on this call, and if this were bi-directional, we could all be brainstorming or chunked into smaller groups. By the way, don't try to brainstorm with more than 6 or 7 people. Brainstorming with 20 people doesn't work. But you can brainstorm asynchronously. You can mind map. We didn't cover that technique, but we do in the master class. There's lots of techniques that you can do to generate ideas and then share ideas, cross-pollinate them, even though you're remote. Have a generation session in video, and then break back up into your separate teams. And wherever you are, you can still have a idea room or a war room for the team that's local, and have your meetings from those rooms. Share your war room in Ireland with my war room in Santa Clara and somebody else's idea room in Singapore. You can create an online version of this kind of dynamic idea generation, and you just have to be really, really good at it, because the distance puts a little extra challenge.
Great. Yeah, and so we have time for one last question over here, and this is also really common across the board, is that how do you kind of balance, the notion of creativity with some of the common constraints, anything from kind of strict regulations, product kind of, related compliances, client wishes, performance and sales results and that kind of stuff. How do you deal with these variables?
Sure. I'd go to IBM's website and look at the Forrester research. But one of the things is they think, well, I'm going to do all this design stuff, but it's going to take too long, or it's going to take too long to figure out what we want. The reality is, most of the time we design stuff that the customers don't want, and so it isn't effective. 70% of new products fail in the first 3 years, or products and services fail in the first 3 years. They never return enough money to pay for the project in the first place. So there's a sort of a false economy going on that says, well, the practical stuff you've got to get done, and we can do this creativity stuff on the side if you want. But what about, right, yes, do people use design thinking in highly regulated industries like medical devices? Absolutely. There's a design thinking and innovation group at Stryker Medical, at Medtronics. I know many of my students work in these organizations. Of course, regulatory issues, and they work at Boeing where there's FAA regulations or medical regulations or other areas. But people, it's about working more creatively and unleashing the engagement of your employees. Look, Gallup does a survey every year. 65% of U.S. employees say they're disengaged from their job. Basically, more than half the workforce comes to work and they don't like it. If you're comfortable with that level of engagement and you think you can just muscle your way through, the problem, good for you. But if you want to be in an organization that wants engaged workers, you have to engage all of the worker, not just the task-based stuff. And so when you create a culture of creativity, it turns out everything goes faster. People resolve problems faster, and they work on the right problems instead of the wrong problems. And so it really is it's a powerful way to do culture change. And I'm thinking, I just would point out, if IBM with 350,000 employees in 160 or 170 different countries can create a generational, organizational change at a massive scale, I'm sure whatever organization you are in can as well.
Great. Well, thanks again, Bill. And unfortunately, we're past the hour here, so we won't have time for any additional questions. But if you have any questions about Stanford's professional programs, about the Innovation Master Series, or just, content-related questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly, and make sure to check your inbox for the webinar recording within the next week. So thank you again, Bill, for this wonderful webinar, and thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully we can see many of you with us here on campus in September.